and thank you for the lovely introduction. It's a privilege to speak with you, and I am pretty informal in my talks. So if you have questions or something isn't making sense, please don't hesitate to ask me. It's okay to challenge me. I often learn a lot that way. So you are the experts. I work primarily with adults, so I do less work with children and adolescents. But I have tried to help out because I know you're just building your mental health program over in Rainbow. And so I have done some work while I've been at university to be able to address those issues. And what they've asked me to talk about is the emotional and psychological needs of the adolescent and young adult population. So a lot of this is going to be stuff I think you know and probably know far better than I do. But in 2013, when the IOM report came out regarding the psychological issues of this population, they divided up a difference between younger-aged AYAs and older-aged AYAs. And those are kinds of things, challenges you have to work with in your field that in the adult field we don't. Adults are adults unless we're looking at really aged adults, and aged adults are not that different than middle-aged adults or even, middle-aged adults. But a 13-year-old is vastly different from a 20-year-old or a 29-year-old because there are so many developmental stages that they're trying to conquer, as you well know, based on Erickson's theory. So at a younger age, what the younger adolescent is really trying to work with is establishing their independence from their parents, which clearly is going to get disrupted. They're trying to complete school, which also gets disrupted, and they're trying to figure out if they're maybe towards the 17, 18-year-old range, like what kind of path do I want to follow? What's my career? What are my hopes and my dreams? Who am I going to be when I get into adulthood? And that also gets put on hold because when you're faced with a life-threatening illness, what you think about is, oh my gosh, am I even going to be here? Let alone am I, what career I'm going to have. If they're a little bit older, and in the older population, again, there's tremendous variety, which makes it far more challenging because you may be talking about a young college student who's moved back home with parents, or a college student who's getting treated in a college town away from their parents. You could be talking about a young adult who is recently married and may or may not have children. So even in that group, there's tremendous variety. But the things that are kind of consistent with that group are trying to look at accomplishing career goals, finding a life partner, and raising a family. So when you talk to AYAs, and there's lots of studies out there, and I will say it's very hard to generalize from study to study, because when they ask these questions in the AYA population is sometimes early on in their journey with this disease, could be post into the survivorship, or could be somewhere in the middle. And so it's hard to compare one study from another. But often what is found is that when they are diagnosed with a life-threatening cancer, this is often their first encounter with mortality. And I was kind of shocked the first time I read that because I thought, like, that never happens hardly with adults that I normally work with. But even in your 20-year-old, they may still have grandparents who are alive and kicking. They may never have been to a funeral. So having to contemplate one's own death is far more distressing for them than even in the adult population. Unmet needs, the percentages are all over the board, but I think it was the HOPE study, 41% of participants in that study said that 12 months post-diagnosis that they felt like they had a lot of unmet psychological needs. And I don't think that's unusual. That is similar to adults because when you're in the middle of treatment, it's really hard for people to decide, oh, I'm going to now deal with all my psychological distress because you feel like crap physically, and you're scared to death. And often I think what happens is, and if you think about your own experiences, if any of you have ever had a life crisis, in the middle of a life crisis, we can't just say, okay, I'm going to pull a crisis on hold, and I'm going to wait, and then I'm going to think about what's happening to me. If you did that, you wouldn't be able to get out of bed the next day and be able to do what you have to do to keep fighting the life crisis. So what most people do, and this is true in your population too, is they put their head down and they sort of barrel through the treatment, and then once they go to survivorship is when they actually can catch their breath, and then they start to think about everything that happened to them and what this meant. And I'm not saying there are no emotional issues during the journey. There are plenty, but they get hit very hard on the other side. And I know on the adult side, and I would imagine there's probably some truth to this in your field as well, is that often clinicians are surprised by this. And they think, like, they're done with their treatment. They're through. They can go back. They can resume their lives, with frequent monitoring. And they don't understand why people then kind of start to crash. But it is normal, and psychologically it kind of makes sense. Many report that they're not even aware of the psychological and support services. I think that hopefully that happens less often in big cancer centers, but most people don't get treated at big cancer centers, and they don't have the supports that you may have here. And so if you get young adults who began treatment somewhere else and then come to you, don't assume that they necessarily know what supports are available to them. And that's also true of the family. People often overlook the family's needs, and they also don't know what's available. And that in the Live Strong study, they showed, which I also think is really kind of an overlooked issue, is the impact on work following treatment that happens with this age population, and that they tend to work fewer hours than compared to people the same age as them, and less stressful jobs, and they are functioning at a lower level of productivity. So there are multiple disruptions, and I like this because of the clock, but truly all these disruptions, I would say the first four are the ones that happen early on, and that you can't avoid, as well as peer relations, which is sort of at the 10 o'clock position. But most of these, or a good percentage of these, where they're going to get hardest hit is following treatment. So there's lots of demands, and this is the Erickson hierarchy, and you can read it, so I'm not going to read that to you. But when they were doing looking at this study in 2013, one of the participants was a Dr. Fasciano, who's a clinical psychologist at Dana-Farber. And she kind of described her work with AYAs this way, and I think to me this was more meaningful than reading the stages. And that's what she said is, when they want more intimacy with their peers and independence from their parents, and they want to feel like they're in control and invulnerable, and the demands of their cancer make them feel isolated, vulnerable, dependent, and uncertain. So it's the polar opposite of what they're trying to accomplish. When they want to feel part of their peer group and fit in, they feel isolated by the uniqueness of what their experience is, and frequently peers start to pull away. When they're developing their sexual identity, their cancer treatments affect their sexual health, they affect their ability to have children, they affect their ability to feel attractive. During a period focused on development of executive functions, where at this stage in brain development, what they're trying to accomplish is refining their skills in planning, organization, mental flexibility, reasoning skills. Well, these get disrupted because of the psychological trauma, but also the chemicals that we're giving them. And one of the things that is clear is that just like when you look at illicit drugs being used in the younger population, and the impact on their brain is very different than when a 40-year-old is taking these drugs. This is true also for chemotherapy. So do we see things with chemo brain and difficulty with cognitive function on the adult side? We do. Do we see as much as you do? We don't. And the other difference is in young brains, it seems to last much longer. It may be lifelong, where sometimes you see that in adults, but usually as they get farther from the treatment, they kind of rebound. And that's, I think, an area where it doesn't seem like there's as much study. And then the fourth thing she said, and when they're trying to make future plans, how do you do that when the future is so elusive and doesn't seem like you may not have a future? The impact on a family, there's a response to crisis that varies for every person. And what is encouraged is, and this takes a lot of resources, and I don't know anybody who has this number of resources, but they're really looking at family needs should be assessed individually, and the young adults should be assessed individually. And then you want to pull these two groups together and facilitate discussion so that both groups understand this is what the family is expecting and needs, this is what the person with the cancer expects and needs. And when you have a young adult who is in a marriage and has young children, it becomes even more complicated because those young children can't tell you what their needs are, but you still have to help them address that. So I'm trying to see, did I miss anything on this slide? I don't think so. So you just want to facilitate that, but that takes a lot of time from social service, and I would imagine your social workers are stretched pretty thin. There are multiple losses, and again, these are sort of what we're talking a lot about these. Fertility, I know you do a really good job in your area with the fertility issues, but the ones that kind of get shortchanged, I think, a lot have to do with the work field. So psychological needs pretty much at some point, and the lowest study I found was 15%, the highest was 41%, that's kind of the range about unmet psychological needs. The truth may be somewhere in between, and my guess is it also depends on where you're getting your cancer care. If you're fortunate enough to live near a major cancer center, then you may get more of your needs met, although not always. And if you're really in a rural area, there may be far less resources available, although, again, I don't think you could assume that that's always true. Family members often suffer tremendous financial hardship. I know recently over on the adult side, because we get our share of AYAs over there, we recently were treating a young woman who at the age of 18 had developed a leukemia, and she lives right on the border between Ohio and Pennsylvania. And at that time, it was much closer for her to go to Pennsylvania to get her treatment, which is what she did. So she was treated, she wound up getting a bone marrow transplant, and then after her transplant, she had to apply for new insurance and had to go on Medicaid, so she had to switch her care to Ohio because Ohio Medicaid is not going to pay for her to go to Pennsylvania. So now she's traveling almost 2 hours to get to Cleveland to get her care. Her parents, this is not a wealthy family, they're quite financially stressed even before she became ill. Mom works as a cashier at one of the big box stores, and Dad was working at the time of her diagnosis. But somebody needed to quit their job in order to take her back and forth to appointments and be home with her and be available to her. Since Mom's job was the only one that carried benefits, Dad is the one who had to quit his job. And that posed a lot of hardship for this young woman because she's a young woman. Okay, so imagine having to do things like she needs to get dressed in the morning. Well, I don't know too many 18 or 20-year-olds who want daddy dressing them, but it really was very stressful for him. It was very stressful for his daughter and for the mother. But they felt like initially that no one was paying attention to how hard this was for them. And unfortunately, after her treatment, she had a very small period of doing well, and then developed sarcoidosis because of graft versus host. So she can barely walk. She can barely do anything for herself. So now Dad is permanently home, and they're probably in their 40s. So this is a lifelong hardship now for this family. And in terms of how do we address their needs, how do we help them financially, what's available to them, I mean, there are all kinds of things that come up. I'm going to use her as an example for the peer support. What she said to me is, when I had cancer and I was fighting cancer, she had been beginning her college. She had just started college when she was diagnosed. So she had friends from high school and college. She used to socialize with them. She talked to them. She said having the cancer is far easier than after the cancer, because once the cancer treatment was done and the leukemia was gone, her friends didn't understand why it is that she couldn't go out and do all these things and why she was having trouble walking and why she was in so much pain. They were like, come on, come with us, and she couldn't. And so she said, I just feel so alone, because all my friends are, I mean, it's asking a lot of 18 and 20-year-olds to cope with somebody else with a life-threatening illness or now this kind of disability. And they couldn't handle it, is my guess, so they pulled away. But she didn't understand that, so she felt like it was all on her. Like, what did I do wrong? Why don't they care about me? And remember, she's in survivorship, so she's not coming to see us very often. And she lives in a very rural area, so it was really hard to construct services to try and provide and fill in that niche for her. And because there are so many issues that come up post-treatment, they are at higher risk, and most of the studies will support this, for substance abuse. The risk factors, I mean, the kids that are most at risk are the same people who are most at risk if they don't have cancer. But you have that in your population. So if they're lower income, if they're Caucasian, if they have few supports, if they have poor coping skills, all those things are going to lead to people using substances, which again poses much higher risk in your population. So, well, why should we care about the psychological needs? Well, one, as human beings, we do. But the other thing is, that is the primary thing that's going to lead to noncompliance. And you have to remember, in your age group, I mean, we have our share of noncompliance on the adult side, but in your age group, part of being a young adult is rebellion and being rebellious. So some of this is kind of innate in who they are and where they are in life. And so they may be non-compliant. They may not finish treatment or give you a hard time about it. They may not follow up. And again, what the studies are showing, and I think that this is kind of true in my experience as well, is in healthcare we don't often stop to think about, why is it that they're doing this? Do they not understand? We're fighting for their life. They should be fighting for their life. Why are they making these stupid decisions? Well, part of it is the effect that things have on their brain. Part of it is that they likely have lack of support, and they don't really understand. And if you approach them like you would approach an adult, to try and reason with them, or to just say, look, you need to either do this, or you maybe need to find follow-up elsewhere because I'm not helping you like this. So you can be more firm with adults and they get it. In this age population, that's a big risk because then you're going to run right into like, oh, we're going to do the headbutting and this is going to be like a war of will. So because they're still young, they're adolescent, and that carries well into the 20s these days. So it's better, they're saying, the psychologists who do this all day and really work with just this population are saying they're finding better success if they approach the adolescent with saying, look, you're right, it is unfair. Look, you're right. We are expecting you to do things that nobody else in your age group is being expected to do, even though they'd be smart if they did it. So we're not going to argue with you about that. You're right, and it is unfair. But the reason that we're saying you need to stay on your meds is because you're at higher risk because of the treatment for all these cardiac problems and all the other problems that they're at risk for. And so we're trying to tell you what you can do to be able to make good choices, to kind of stack the deck for yourself. But we respect the fact that you have a right to disagree with us and to choose not to do this. They're less likely to leave treatment if you approach them that way and treat them like they're an adult and give them the information, because they feel like you're partnering with them and you're not bossing them. And I think that's hard, and I can't even imagine how hard it is, because a lot of the people you treat are children. And children, you can boss around. You can boss them around. You can boss the parents around. A big thing in survivorship also that comes up is this fear of recurrence. And although fear of recurrence comes up with adults, I don't think on either side of the age spectrum we do a particularly good job of that. And part of the reason is the fears tend to be, they are able to look at those fears more clearly when they're done with treatment. And that's also when they're less likely to be coming to us very often. So planting seeds and helping them to expect that and helping them to know what the resources are to deal with that is really important before you jettison them into life. So one of the things, if they have to deal with end of life, and a certain percentage of your patients, I'm sure, do, one of the things they have found that is more unique to young adults than to adults is because of the profound fatigue and shortness of breath and pain that they have as they approach towards the end. They are finding that an intervention to keep them from sort of wallowing in depression and getting really sad is to really get physical therapies, occupational therapies, and if needed, speech therapies involved. There's a lot of work being done at St. Jude's around this, and they really offer this to all their young adults who are facing end of life. I don't think in Cleveland we do such a hot job of that. Maybe you do in Rainbow, and if you do, that's wonderful. But it's kind of a unique intervention, and I think it really does help them because it helps the fatigue and the pain and the dyspnea. But it also, I think, is a way to keep them going and giving them some energy that they need for dealing with these issues. A lot of things that young adults worry about, and less so in my population, is the impact their death is going to have on their parents and their siblings, their friends. Often, if they're involved in support programs or chat rooms online or with any of the AYA groups, they start to withdraw. And part of the reason they do is because they've often lost friends in those groups, and they know how painful it was for them. And so they don't want to put their friends through it. So they often stop coming at that time, which then withdraws a lot of their support. They also really worry tremendously about what legacy am I leaving. And adults do that too, but it is much easier to help an adult with that because they have longer life history. When you're working with a 20-year-old or an 18-year-old that's facing dying, trying to figure out and help them understand their legacy is much more challenging and is going to take more work. So again, it sort of argues the reason why they need a lot of psychological support. The other thing that comes up with around end of life for these patients is many of them have said when they've done open-ended studies and interviews, they've commented on the fact that when they've lost friends in a support group or a chat room, it has been really hard for them because they go home to their parents and they say, somebody died, and the parents kind of want to change the subject or they don't want to talk about it. And the young adults have said this is particularly painful and hard for them because they feel like they can't push their parents to do this, but they also feel like nobody understands how hard this is and all the issues it's bringing up to them. So if you are running support groups and somebody is approaching death, please be aware that the more doors you open to allow them to talk about dying and death, the better better those people will do. And I do think a lot of times it's hard as a clinician to want to open those doors, because sometimes we feel like, I don't know what to say, because these are scary things and I'm not sure what to tell them. But they're not so much looking for us to make it right. They know how scary death is. They just need to talk about it, and they need to grieve it. And when we don't allow that, then that leads to more problems. I also think with end-of-life issues, coaching the family on ways to help the family understand what it is the person who's dying wants. So even though you're a parent or even though you're a spouse, it has to be what they want, and to honor that. And that's harder. I don't think it's so hard for the spouses. It's very hard for parents. So really helping them to let go a little bit. I'm going to kind of go over that. So this is the fun part. So treatment of anxiety. What do you do when you have a lot of anxiety? Well, I don't know anybody with cancer who doesn't have some anxiety. It's kind of normal. And I think normalizing it helps a lot of people, including AYAs. But sometimes, even when you allow them to talk about the anxiety and normalize it, it's not enough. And you're seeing that they're up late at night, they're anxious, they can't sleep, they're not eating, they worry all the time, they're more tearful, and the family reports that, they report it, and it needs more intervention than probably just talking about it. So if the anxiety is related to something short-term, so for instance, if you have somebody who is at the beginning of their treatment and they are really scared and anxious, but you know once they get a treatment plan and things start moving and they've got something like a plan to live with, that the anxiety often will go down. So you're looking for something short-term, and I think the benzos are the most helpful drugs for those situations, because if it's long-term anxiety, they're going to eventually no longer be potent, and unless you want to keep upping these doses, which I wouldn't recommend, and I don't think anybody in mental health would recommend these days, then you're kind of stuck. So you always want to start slow, start low and go slow with all these drugs because they're young, and most of them have not been widely studied in young adults. So that's the other reason why you want to do that. I think Ativan, Xanax, and Xerax, all three of those are great for, if anxiety fluctuates. If somebody is a nervous wreck all day long, you're better off going with something like Klonopin because it's twice a day. You can give it to them in the morning, at night. Sometimes with adults, if they're extreme anxiety, we have some people take it every 8 hours instead of every 12. But the majority of people can manage every 12. And once the crisis or whatever is precipitating the anxiety is over, you can start tapering them off. But you always have to taper these meds. You can't ever just stop them. And that is something to educate the person, the young adult about, but also family members, so that everybody that's involved in that close circle is aware they can't just stop taking these. If anxiety is more chronic, if they've always kind of been a worrier, or they describe it's not in relation to some event or something that's coming up, or the uncertainty, and the uncertainty will be resolved in 3 or 4 weeks, then you want to look at something that's more long-acting. And most of the people who are prescribing these drugs are psycho-oncologists, which are really the psychiatrists who are trained in oncology. And so then they look more at the antidepressants. So the kinds of things that we would use most often in the adolescent or young adults are Lexapro, Effexor or venlafaxine, duloxetine, which is helpful not just for the anxiety, but also if you've got pain, that's a really helpful one to use. And Seroquel, which is really helpful for anxiety, but it also helps with sleep. If the person is depressed, and depression and anxiety definitely can occur together, but sometimes people are just depressed, they're not anxious. One of the things that we use in mental health, there's a million screens out there, and I'm sure you're familiar with many of them. However, this one is not, it doesn't cost you anything. It's what the psychiatrist for years have been using, and they call it Siggy caps, which is a mnemonic that's easy to remember. So what you want to assess are sleep changes. Are they falling asleep, having trouble falling asleep, staying asleep, or waking up too early? You want to find out about any of those, and is that different from before they got sick? Have they had a loss of interest? And often the way I will ask them is, what kinds of things made you the happiest? What were the things that gave you most joy in your life? And if they still are giving them joy, and if they say, well, yeah, and I say, well, is it still at the same level? That would be the other thing to ask, because if it's at a far diminished level, that's a problem. Guilt or worthlessness, and some ways to ask that is to ask them, do you ever kind of ruminate or just constantly think about negative things or negative constructs, either about your future, yourself, decisions you've made in the past, whatever. But if they're constantly thinking about those things, that's a sign of depression. Lack of energy, changes in concentration. Do they have trouble when they're reading something for school or for work? Do they have to read the same paragraph 3 times before they get it? If they're watching a movie or a TV show, do they lose their train of thought? When they're talking to somebody, they get lost in thought and can't concentrate on the conversation? Appetite. Psychomotor, which is, are they either like really agitated and anxious and nervous and wringing their hands, or are they just really slow? They walk slow, they talk slow, everything's really slowed down. And then suicide, and do they have thoughts? And to me, the easiest, what I often do is normalize, because people bristle when you bring up suicide, and a lot of clinicians are afraid to bring it up because they think if we talk about it, I still run into people who say, well, I don't like to ask them because I don't want to plant any seeds and make them suicidal. And the way I approach it with cancer patients is, look, when people are going through all this, there are a lot of people who frequently feel, if I didn't wake up in the morning, that would kind of be okay. Not because they want to die, but just because this is hard. Do you ever feel like that? That's a way of introducing suicide gently. And if they say, yeah, I feel like that, I would say, you know what? It's kind of normal, like I said. And I'm not real worried about that, nor any psychiatrist, because hoping you don't wake up in the morning is not the same as wanting to kill yourself. But that then, it's easier then to say, but sometimes then people are so distressed and the suffering is so profound that they feel like maybe it would be better for them or their families to just end their life. Have you ever felt like that? Because it does happen with people who are this sick and have to deal with so much upheaval in their life. And again, if you normalize it, people will be honest with you and they say, well, yeah, I have thought about it. Well, what have you thought about? And what you want to assess is, do they have a plan? How lethal is the plan? Do they have the means to carry it out? Is it easily accessible? So if somebody says, I want to drive my car off the bridge, and they're frequently going to drives to calm down, that's pretty serious. If they're saying they want to hang themselves or shoot themselves, it's pretty serious. If they've got a boatload of drugs at home, which I'm sure they do, and they are lethal drugs where if they took the whole bottle they could die, then it's easy access. So, but if they say, well, I've thought about, killing myself with a car, but they don't have a driver's license. Or I've thought about, shooting myself, but they don't have a gun, and nobody in their family has a gun, and they really don't know anyone where they can get one. Then I'm a little less worried. You still have to be worried. I'm not saying you shouldn't, but it's not like you need to be urgently worried. So those are the ways you would ask the questions about suicide. The hard thing about assessing depression, I think, in the cancer population, regardless of the age, is half the symptoms that are positive for depression are positive in every cancer patient in the world. So I don't care I ask them, but if they have a poor appetite and they're having trouble sleeping and they have no energy, doesn't matter to me because it's pretty much the way all of them feel. Even if they're moving slowly, I don't worry about that because a lot of people do. The things that I think are most telling in the cancer population are their depth of hopelessness about wanting to die, or wanting to live. And not so much energy, but motivation. Sometimes I'll say to them, if you had the energy, if you weren't feeling so crummy, do you think you have the motivation to want to get out more and do the things you used to do? And people will know that, and it helps them to think about it that way. And if they say, no, I don't eat if I felt good, I just don't want to do anything. If I could just sleep in bed all day, that would be fine. That's depression. That's not cancer. And the other thing is how much joy is in their life. What makes you happy? Is there anything that introduces joy? If people have lost the capacity for joy or it's greatly diminished, that is not normal in a cancer experience. It is normal in depression. So even if they don't have the 5 items, I would still say, because they're going to have 3 of the 5 automatically with the sleep, the eating, and the energy. So you only need a couple to really build the case. The symptoms have to be present for 2 weeks. And that, so if they show positive, I'd say, how long have you been feeling this way? And if they say for a month, I'd say, okay, in that month, were there any days that were really good days? And if they say, well, there were some days that were a little bit better, but I never felt good, I never got anywhere near where it's good, that's more likely depression. If they say, well, it's really been the last 2 days, but 3 days ago I felt pretty good, then it's probably more an adjustment disorder, but you still have to keep depression on your radar. So how do you treat depression? Well, one big way is with therapy and counseling. But if they're severely depressed, people with therapy and counseling are going to take 5 years to get better. And frequently, by the time depression gets better, they're going to be dead in some other way. Because if they're not suicidal now and you have to deal with depression, you're going to be suicidal at the end. For what it's worth, and one of the things I have learned in working with cancer patients, and I didn't appreciate this when I worked in psychiatry 20 years ago, is that I've had several now cancer patients say to me, who don't know each other, and these were independent discussions, you know, I've had cancer and I've had depression in my life before. If I had to choose between one or the other, give me the cancer. I'd rather deal with the cancer than the depression. And that really shocked me, because I think unless people have experienced it, like we all know the cancer journey is horrible. I don't think most of us would ever say depression is worse. But the people who've had both tell me it's not that unusual to hear that the depression is worse. And the reason I'm telling you that is I want to motivate people to please identify this early, because early on they can hold it together. They can come in and smile. They can act like everything is fine when you're there, or when the physician's there, or the team is there. But behind closed doors, they are suffering. They just can put on a happy face because they don't want to burden you and they don't want to burden their family. And I cannot tell you the number of times people have said to me, I get called because they're sobbing in infusion and nobody knows why. And the people say to me, you know, well, I've been feeling like this for 9 months, but I just can't hold it in anymore. And it is because nobody's asked. So I would never assume that depression isn't there. And what I say to the adults, and you can say the same thing to the young adults, if you've been depressed before, you're more likely to get depressed when you have cancer. And why is that? Because it puts you on a boatload of steroids, and that's likely to upset the apple cart. But if you've never been depressed in your life before, you have a much higher incidence of depression. Even at the lowest rates, they're saying it's 30% of the population. Okay, in the normal population, it's 10%, 9 to 10%. Why is that? Because a lot of the medicines and treatment we use to treat cancer probably are disrupting the chemicals in the brain to keep mood stable. So people, it's not unusual to see cancer. And I think if you explain this to people, then they're less likely to feel like it's them, that they don't know how to cope, that they don't know how to do things, that they don't know how to make this work better. It isn't them. It's sometimes us. And even if it is them, I don't care if I'm giving them an out and saying, you know, the treatment is contributing to it, because it likely is. Otherwise, we wouldn't see. Like if you look at the incidence of depression in heart disease, it's the same as the general population. And people who are dying of heart disease aren't any less stressed than people dying of cancer or with a life-threatening illness. So I do think the medicines are making a difference. So with the medicines, you can use SSRIs. I mean, you want to use the ones, please don't anyone, if you could avoid it, don't use any of the old ones because they're way too high in side effects. So the SSRIs, the SRNIs, and also the atypical antidepressants are ones that people use now mostly because the side effect profile is low. However, so Lexapro is pretty common in this group. In young adults, they use it a lot because it's tolerated well, and the dosing there is there for you. GI upset is a problem, and usually if they take it with food, that can mitigate it a little bit. But the other problem is sexual dysfunction, and that is a huge problem with every antidepressant unless you give them Wellbutrin. Wellbutrin doesn't have that side effect, but it's not always the most powerful antidepressant. But if sexual functioning is extremely important, and that is really adding to their depression, then most psychiatrists would try one of the drugs that have less, like Wellbutrin, that would take care of that. Effexor and duloxetine are the other two that you see a lot, and those have tremors, fast heartbeat, hypertension, and again, sexual dysfunction. If you put young people on any antidepressant, they are really more prone, the young people and old people are more prone to what's called Serotonin Syndrome. And that is a life-threatening condition. If it occurs, then it needs to be treated in an ICU. So if you're going to use these drugs, you really need to be monitoring, and you need to educate the person and the family members about this. So if they see that the person's getting more agitated, if they see that they're a little more confused, or that they are hallucinating, or they're paranoid, if they are developing myoclonus or hyperreflexia, if they're really perspiring, or they develop high fevers, you need to get them into the emergency room, and they need to get into the emergency room, because if it's not treated, people will die. And sometimes this is missed because people don't see it that often. And in the general adult population, it's not that common. It's just the elderly and the young that are most vulnerable. If it's going to happen, it's not going to happen 20 months into treatment with these drugs. It's going to happen in the, at the beginning, the first couple months. Other things to consider with these drugs, because these patients are on so many other medicines, you really need to look at the interactions with other medicines they may be taking. And I will tell you, when we have transplants, like our transplant patients, because there are so many interactions that impact blood counts, we often will ask the psychiatrist to come in, or like the psycho-oncologist to come over and help the oncologist, because it gets really tricky about which drugs you can use or not. But the Effexor interacts with tamoxifen, so if they're on tamoxifen, you can't use that. Remeron is, like I said, helpful for sleep. Some of the cancer drugs interact with the SSRIs, and bupropion is the Wellbutrin. If they have neuropathic pain, Effexor and Cymbalta can be really helpful in both those situations. Actually, we're using more and more of the Cymbalta. And if you do put somebody on Effexor, that is one of the drugs, antidepressants, that you have to really taper very slowly because people can go through withdrawal. The most common psychiatric diagnosis you're going to encounter is you will see depression and anxiety, but adjustment disorder is most common. And you're going to see, they're going to have depressive features, they're going to have features of anxiety, they often coexist, but they're not going to be as extreme or as intense with people who have major depression. They may have it, but they may have good days in between. So with those, what you really want to do is more therapy. You don't necessarily need meds unless they really want meds or the anxiety is intolerable. So that's the end of my talk. What questions, comments? No? Okay. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate your time, and I wish you a good day.